they can put their money on the Cayman Islands and Bermuda, places where it is not taxable. They can hire lobbyists to lobby on their behalf. That way they can get tax breaks or subsidies paid for by the taxpayer. But they play by different rules than the common person. That means that the common person then has to pay higher taxes. If you look at how many taxes we've gotten since 1913, which was the implementation of the first income tax, we now have payroll tax, property tax, will tax. Depending on your location, you have sales tax or you have a state income tax. The government prints more money, adds more money to the money supply. The Roman Empire had that happen. We will get into the Roman currency devaluation, how they devalued their currency. Or you go deeper into debt, which the Roman Empire did. Something interesting, though, is that the cities became so expensive, the city centers, kind of like California and New York today, that the wealthy would move out of those areas. They would move into the countryside. They would purchase all that land, and then they would hire servants to do the work. Speaking of which, the reason that you see such a increase in the income between the rich and the poor is because of the current economic structure of the United States. In the Roman Empire, you had slaves who would perform labor jobs, who would work in the fields, who would be craftsmen. The way that an average Roman citizen could move up into the middle class was by agriculture, by working and toiling in the land. But when they added more slaves to the labor pool, it increased the competition for the jobs, the menial jobs that were available. Therefore, it lowered the standard of living across the board. Well, if you look today, the United States has a lot of low-skilled immigrants that are willing to work in manufacturing jobs. These jobs have more people competing in the labor pool. They are willing to work longer hours for lower pay, for lower benefits. And if you're not willing to do the same, then you simply are not hired by these corporations. As a result, the United States manufacturing jobs are no longer available. And the ones that are, they pay lower as a result of an increase in the labor pool. But they're also outshoring a lot of jobs because of trade deals, NAFTA, GATT, deals like that. According to the Department of U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, 79% of the United States economy is now service, working at restaurants, waiting tables, stocking shelves, instead of manufacturing, like it once was. Back in the 1950s and 60s, even the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, you could graduate high school, get a job working at General Motors, Ford, a manufacturing job. You could make enough money to have your own house, to raise kids on one income. So similar to Rome, similar to the United States, similar to all this situation, the Roman Empire no longer had the middle class. Think about the United States today. The middle class is shrinking because there is no way for them to move up. There are just not the same economic opportunities. And the millennials are the first generation that are not going to live as well as their parents did. Their standards of living is smaller. And of course, the military was conquering these certain areas. But since they were not expanding their empire in the 2nd century, you did not have the jobs for the Roman legion, which is the Roman army, for people to move up. But basically, the parallels that I see is that there was not a way for the middle class to move up because the wealthy owned all the means of production and they were hiring an increasing labor class. While the competition for those jobs was increasing, the availability of those jobs, the supply of those jobs was decreasing. The third is the rise of the Eastern Empire. In the late 3rd century, Diocletian divided the empire into two halves. The Western Empire, seated in the city of Milan, and the Eastern Empire in Byzantine, later known as Constantinople. The division made the empire more easily governable in the short term, but over time, the two halves drifted apart. East and West failed to adequately work together to combat outside threats, and the two often squabbled over resources and military aid. As the gulf widened, the largely Greek-speaking Eastern Empire grew in wealth, while the Latin-speaking West descended into economic crisis. The strength of the Eastern Empire served to divert barbarian invasions to the West. Emperors like Constantine ensured that the city of Constantinople was fortified and well guarded. But Italy and the city of Rome, which only had symbolic value for many in the East, were left vulnerable. The West fell in the 5th century, but the Eastern Empire endured in some form or another for another 1,000 years before being overwhelmed by the Ottoman Empire in the 1400s. You see that today. You see, maybe not to this extreme, maybe not this vivid, but if you notice, places like New Jersey, New York, California, they are a different planet comparatively to places like Alabama, Ohio, Florida, Tennessee. You see a lot of division. A lot of people who live in the cities, like Maryland, D.C., they tend to be more liberal-minded. A lot of people who live in the country, in the county, outside of the city areas, they tend to be more conservative, more Republican. You see this divide extremely in terms of Donald Trump. He is just symbolic of the divisions that have always existed in the country. It's just now the wound is more open rather than being patched up. He is not the cause, and when he is out of office, these divisions will not go away. Basically, though, we see this division between geographic location, just like the Roman Empire did. Overexpansion and military overspending. At its height, the Roman Empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Euphrates River in the Middle East. But that might have also been its downfall. With such a vast territory to govern, the empire faced an administrative and logistical nightmare. Even with their excellent road systems, the Romans were unable to communicate quickly or effectively enough to manage their holdings. Rome struggled to marshal enough troops and resources to defend its frontiers from local rebellions and outside attacks. And by the 2nd century, the Emperor Hadrian was forced to build his famous wall in Britain just to keep the enemy at bay. As more and more funds were funneled into the military upkeep of the empire, technological advancement slowed and Rome's civil infrastructure fell into disrepair. Now, think of the Vietnam War. Think of the Afghan War. Think of the Iraq War. Think of all these bullshit wars the United States has gotten into based upon false premises, but these specific wars have offered the United States no monetary benefit or nothing in return. Meanwhile, our infrastructure has not been rebuilt since the 1950s. The 1950s was the last time. That's when they started building the interstate highways. They started building infrastructure. But since that time, our infrastructure has deteriorated. Our roads, our bridges around us have deteriorated. Meanwhile, we have been building things in other countries, schools in Iraq, schools in Afghanistan that have been blown up. Then we rebuild them. You see the infrastructure literally decaying in front of you. We are beginning to have the remnants of a once great civilization. Government corruption and political instability. The sheer size of Rome, combined with ineffective and inconsistent leadership, magnified the problem. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries, civil trust thrusted the empire into chaos, and more than 20 men took the throne in the span of only 75 years, usually after the murder of their preceder. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard, assassinated and installed new sovereigns at will, and once even auctioned the spot off to the highest bidder. The political rot was also extended to the Roman Senate, which failed to temper the excesses of the emperor due to its own widespread corruption and incompetence. As the situation worsened, civic pride waned, and many Roman citizens lost trust in their leadership. Sound familiar? Even though the United States has only had one civil war in its history, fortunately, one could possibly be on the horizon. You see, half the country supports Trump, half the country doesn't, which is a completely different ideology. Maybe not to the same extent, but I was reading this article from The Guardian the other day. It said that most politicians who regulate certain industries, like tech, healthcare, they're on these committees. They have stock in certain companies that they are supposed to be regulating. They're becoming rich by regulating certain competition, writing specific rules. Meanwhile, they are becoming exceedingly corrupt in both parties. Politics is kind of auctioned off to the highest bidder. If you look at the WikiLeaks emails, you will see that Citibank basically picked everyone who was in Obama's cabinet. The big banks wrote a list of who Obama should appoint to his cabinet. He appointed almost everyone who the big banks told him to. Obama, Bush, they are there for the highest bidder. Just like the Roman Empire, the political rot is in everywhere. The politicians are exceedingly becoming more and more out of touch and corrupt. People are losing that civic pride of what it means to be an American. Used to be no matter your race, no matter your location in this great country, you were proud to be an American. But because of the civic rot, the political instability, all of these factors culminating at once, people no longer have that civic pride of what it means to be an American. Just like in Rome, because they lost their common language, their common culture, all these factors, people no longer had the pride of what it meant to be a Roman.